My name is Michael Gill. I'm professor of philosophy and head of department here at the University of Arizona. My interests are mainly in moral philosophy, and I'm interested in the history of moral philosophy going all the way back to the ancient Greeks and through the 17th and 18th century and right up to the present day. And I'm also interested in what we call normative philosophy, not just the history of ethics, but how we ought to live, what ethics can teach us about what we should do in our day-to-day life, what our actual obligations are. What first got me interested in moral philosophy and got me hooked was an article that I read when I was a freshman in college. It was an article that came out in 1973 by the philosopher Peter Singer, who's still well known and quite famous. And in this article, he made this argument which I've never quite been able to get out of my head. What Peter Singer argued was that if something very, very bad is about to happen, and you can prevent that very, very bad thing from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, then you have a moral obligation to do so. So the conclusion of his argument was we ought to sacrifice all of our luxuries to prevent people from starving across the world. And when I was a freshman in college, I read that and it got its grips into me. I thought, that seems deeply intuitive. And yet, if you take that seriously, it completely changes your life. If you take that seriously, you've got to give up basically everything you think is less important than a starving child's life. And it doesn't seem right to me that we should entirely change our lives. And yet, I couldn't see what was wrong with Peter Singer's argument. That's what got me interested in moral philosophy in the first place, and that's really what the topic of this course is. The view that the right thing to do is what will ever create the greatest happiness for the greatest good, even if that means you have to sacrifice some of your own happiness. What do I think is moral philosophy? There are lots of different answers to that question, and I suppose there are two main kinds of things that interest me in moral philosophy. On the one hand, I'm interested in the history of moral philosophy, which is the history of what people have thought ought to guide our lives. The other aspect of moral philosophy is non-historical. It's not a question of what other people have thought. It's not a question of what Aristotle or Immanuel Kant or John Stuart Mill might have thought hundreds of years ago. It's a question, at the end of the day, from the first-person perspective, what should you do? How should you live your life? What obligations should you live up to? If, in fact, our obligations are to do the most good in the world, 200 years ago, that might have been do the most good for people in your village. But now it can mean you have obligations to people you're never going to meet. So this is a case in which the two interests I have in moral philosophy, the historical interest and the interest about what we ought to do in our day-to-day lives, while they might have some relationship, also might split apart in really interesting and fascinating ways. So those are the two aspects of moral philosophy, and in this course we'll talk about both aspects and the relationship between them. I've taught humanities seminars in the past, and it was a fantastic experience for me. I learned as much as my students did, I hope, and I can't wait to do it again. The course, Utilitarianism, the Greater Good, is one that I think we're all going to learn a lot from. We're all going to be able to really enjoy seeing the history of philosophy and looking at our obligations today. Hope to see you there October 3rd.